Next on Secrets of War. They're the means by which to confuse an enemy, forcing him into making a fatal mistake. When manipulated with skill and cunning, tools of deception can be the most deadly weapons of all. From decoy tanks and phony radio broadcasts to the spy whose lies led Hitler to ruin. Tools of Deception is next on Secrets of War.
For as long as man has taken up arms, deception has been a part of warfare.
Deception is only the other side of the coin of strategy.
Military deception is to hide your strengths, but at the same time also hide your weaknesses. It's to delude the enemy into attacking you where you're strong and to stop them attacking you where you're weak.
Deception is vital because if you can keep the enemy guessing about your intentions, then clearly you have an advantage.
The whole basis of much of military tactics and military strategy involves deception.
It can be as simple as hiding behind a tree or as complex as creating a false army. But the means and goals of military deception are essentially the same.
Basically, what you're trying to do is totally mislead the enemy so that he makes preparations which are going to be a waste of his resources.
The skillful employment of misdirection, stealth, and subterfuge in wartime can mean the difference between victory and defeat. As warfare has become more complex, the role of deception has become more important. Perhaps the oldest and simplest form of tactical deception is camouflage. Practiced throughout history, it wasn't until World War I that improved optics and the advent of aerial reconnaissance forced the evolution of the practice into an art.
In the First World War, when the fighting on the Western Front became pretty static, it was very difficult to do anything without being seen by the other side. And so camouflage came into its own.
In the autumn of 1914, artist Guérin d'Escavola, a private in the French army, first proposed using painted canvas to conceal the guns of his unit. Until that time, only natural materials, shrubbery and mud had been used for that purpose. The French General Staff was so impressed with d'Escavola's work that he was promoted to lieutenant and put in command of the first camouflage unit in modern history. The British Army followed suit, creating its own camouflage corps in 1915.
Camouflage was first tried by the French and then was eventually adopted by the British, and it became a task of the Royal Engineers. And we formed specialist units whose task was to devise methods of camouflaging and to produce the materials that were required. And they were a most interesting group of people.
Artists, sculptors, and theater scenery painters were recruited into the British Camouflage Service. Dubbed the Special Works Park, they were similar to their French counterparts. When the Americans entered the war in 1917, General John Pershing, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief in France, demanded that a similar American unit be formed. Along with producing canvas and later netting screens to conceal armaments and installations, d'Escavola's camoufleurs were charged with making, among other things, observation posts disguised as animals or trees. As aerial reconnaissance increased, so did the demand for camouflage. By 1918, Discabola's unit employed more than 9,000 military and civilian men and women. By the Second World War, camouflage was an accepted facet of tactical planning. Every soldier received training in concealing himself and his equipment. Camouflage uniforms became standard issue, with in-field tailoring done on occasion to accommodate changing conditions, though sometimes circumstances dictated a bit of improvisation. Heavy equipment, trucks, tanks, and artillery were given special treatment.
The aim of camouflage is to break up the lines of a piece of military equipment so that it either looks like something which it's not, more powerful, less powerful, or innocent, or else it fades away completely.
Equipment was painted according to terrain, climate, and season. Greens and browns for the European forests in the summer, white for the Russian winter, and tans and browns for the North African desert. Netting, woven with appropriately colored strips of burlap, was used to mask the shape and eliminate telltale shadows. These techniques were often supplemented with natural materials, such as branches or hay. The Germans skillfully employed the principles of camouflage to hide what was essentially impossible to hide: the massive guns of the Atlantic Wall. The 2,400-mile-long complex of concrete, barbed wire, and machine gun nests that were to defend Fortress Europe from an Allied invasion. Of course, none of these techniques, no matter how artfully applied, could hide a speeding tank. Camouflage was only truly effective when the tank was stationary.
One of the great advantages of camouflage is that if you have a tank holed up somewhere that the enemy hasn't spotted, if that tank can get 3 or 4 rounds away before it's spotted, it's going to knock out possibly 3 or 4 tanks. And that is an advantage, but the tank has sacrificed its other great advantage of mobility for that. Once it's found out, it has got to get the hell out of it. Otherwise, it's going to get a hammering wherever it is.
Not blessed with the mobility of a tank, pillboxes and bunkers had only a couple of feet of concrete and imaginative camouflage to protect them. Hidden when possible, attempts were made to make them appear less threatening when invisibility was not feasible. With a little paint and some imagination, even large gun emplacements could be made to look slightly less conspicuous. But World War II brought a new threat.
If you look at camouflage historically, it reaches a real full flower in World War II. And one reason it does is there's a whole new element added, and that is, what does this thing look like from the air? Because now you're really under surveillance from the air. Reconnaissance planes are going to fly over. They're going to look at you. They're going to figure out where your bomb factory is or where your troops are. So you have to camouflage for viewing from the air.
For the first time, large, long-range aircraft made the camouflaging of sites far behind the front lines a necessity. Cities, factories, and airfields previously out of the range of the fighting were suddenly, glaringly at risk. As it became more of a threat, the airplane also became a more valuable asset. To lessen their vulnerability, aircraft were moved away from airfields and spread into residential areas where they were less likely to be attacked, and if attacked, could only be damaged one at a time. For further protection, more than 600 operational airfields in Great Britain were camouflaged with paint and artificial hedges. The emergence of the airplane also dictated that anti-aircraft guns be stationed throughout the country, and these guns, in turn, needed to be protected. In rural areas where the lack of heavy vegetation made traditional forms of camouflage impractical, anti-aircraft guns were hidden in some very creative ways. A fake farmhouse made of lightweight materials could be moved by a few men in a matter of seconds. The roof on this barn slid away to reveal its deadly charge. An anti-aircraft gun could also be hidden beneath an imaginatively designed tennis court. And an innocent-looking haystack was not quite so innocent. Despite the best efforts of the camoufleurs, the damage on both sides was extensive, with industrial cities being the hardest hit.
Probably the best thing the Germans did in the form of camouflage was camouflaging a section of Hamburg, their most important port and also the headquarters of German intelligence. It was a very important city to the Germans. They camouflaged the central business district so that it looked like it was part of the terrain that was coming in from the outskirts of Hamburg. And this worked for a while.
As the war escalated and the bombing became less discriminate, Hamburg was leveled, a victim of the type of carpet bombing meant to bring a country to its knees. At this point, the disguising of a city became less important than survival itself. While camouflage is meant to conceal, decoys are meant to attract attention and draw enemy fire. Practiced in one form or another for centuries, decoys or dummies were reinvented in the First World War. Dummies were made for a variety of things, from dummy heads made to draw the fire and reveal the position of snipers, to fake artillery pieces. Perhaps the most widely and effectively used decoys were fake tanks.
The dummy tanks first appeared during the First World War, and they were simply lightweight canvas-on-wood replicas, which were used partly for training, but also to give the effect of large masses of tanks being where tanks really were not, to confuse enemy aerial reconnaissance. Between the wars, the whole subject is dropped, and as usual, it has to be reinvented in the Second World War. You'll never find anyone carrying over a good idea from one war to the next.
Probably nowhere were these decoys used better in the Second World War than in the North African desert.
Deception is the weapon of the weak. And in the Middle East, facing the Italians in Libya and Ethiopia, we were really very weak indeed.
When Mussolini ordered the invasion of Egypt in June of 1940, there were 250,000 Italian troops in all of Africa, as opposed to only 36,000 British. For the assault on Sidi Barrani, the odds weren't quite so daunting, but the British were still outnumbered by more than 2 to 1.
This is December 1940 in Egypt, the beginning of General Wevo's great offensive, which eventually drove the Italians out of North Africa. And his first battle was to be a big tank battle. To make it look good, he wanted some dummy tanks, to make it look as if there were more than there actually were.
Without a formal program for the production of decoys in the desert, the Royal Engineers were called upon for the task. In a single night, they produced 80 wood and canvas dummies, which were folded up, loaded on trucks, and sent to the front. Placed at the back of the formation behind the real tanks, the decoys were never seen by the enemy from the ground, only from high aerial reconnaissance. Therefore, they didn't need to be detailed or extremely precise.
There are roughly 2 parts to it. The body was a diagonal-shaped thing, rather like an enlarged cake of soap, and then a smaller, squarer frame representing the turret, which rested on top.
Three days after the first assault, the British had taken 39,000 Italian prisoners. What was intended to be only a 5-day raid turned into a major offensive.
Which was the first of our victories in the war, actually. Our tanks were victorious over the Italians. In fact, they scuppered the whole Italian army. And it's fun to say that these dummies contributed to it, although in fact they didn't fire anything.
As the use of decoys expanded, the decoy itself evolved. And by 1944, the wood and canvas dummies had been replaced in many theaters by lighter, less expensive inflatables. Produced by both Britain and the United States in a wide variety of designs, covering all of the major weapon systems, the inflatable decoys were quite convincing. From the air, they looked amazingly like their steel counterparts. Of similar size and shape, they cast convincing shadows, a primary means of identifying weapons and vehicles in aerial photographs. Even from the ground, they could be mistaken for the real thing. The new decoys were preferred in many circumstances because of their light weight and portability. An inflatable tank decoy could be deployed in minutes and would fit in a package about the size of a sleeping bag. But the deception went even further.
In addition to the visual effects, sound is important, and sonic deception was something that both Britain and the United States specialised in at one time. And this was to have ordinary light armoured vehicles, scout cars, that sort of thing, rigged with enormous speakers that would go around replaying the sound of battle, the sound of tanks roaring around, in areas, again, where they were not expected. And that really seems to work quite well at times, especially in the latter fighting in Germany, when the enemy is on edge, when you can throw him off balance by just making sounds, especially at night, which give the impression of a large force being near. That seemed to work very well.
The level to which the military had developed such deceptions can be seen in this recently declassified 1943 training film. Here, used in conjunction with dummy landing craft and inflatable soldiers, sonic deception is used to fake a landing while the real landing is executed nearby. Operating from behind a smokescreen, sound boats play recordings of landing craft engines through loudspeakers. The boats make 3 passes, increasing the volume with each successive pass. The dummy soldiers are released into the surf. Their bobbing is meant to resemble soldiers wading ashore. After the sound boats make their 3rd pass, the dummy landing craft emerge from the smoke, drawing the enemy's attention and fire as the real landing begins some distance away. Dummy paratroops were also used to simulate assaults. Called Ruperts by the British and Dolls by the Germans, they were about 2 feet tall, but from a distance against an empty sky, it was impossible to determine their scale.
We dropped hundreds of dummy parachutists, which when they hit the ground burst into firecracker-type noise, which made the Germans believe that perhaps we were landing an airborne army in that particular area, when in fact we were landing the airborne army in areas remote from the battle, but for other reasons.
As production increased, the use of decoys changed from primarily tactical deception to strategic deception as well. The most famous example occurred during preparations for D-Day, when decoys were used to suggest a buildup of troops in Berkshire to convince the Germans that the invasion would come on the northern French coast, rather than in Normandy.
I remember that on or about June 10, 1944, I was then living in the Chiltern Hills in England, and I was out mushrooming, at the crack of dawn, when quite suddenly in the next field, I noticed the whole field flowered into tanks. They just rose out of the grass like this until, there were Churchill tanks there were Sherman tanks there, all sorts of tanks there. A couple of hundred, I suppose. And of course, these were the famous rubber tanks. This was Patton getting his army together to make the assault across the English Channel to the part of Calais.
Larger-scale decoys were deployed on both sides with varying degrees of success. By 1940, it had become apparent that camouflage was not enough to protect Britain's valuable air force, so dummy airfields were built to divert attention and bombs. 2 types of fake airfields were fabricated. K-sites were built for daytime raids and observation. From the air, they looked like operational airfields with runways and dummy airplanes. Fake hangars, however, were deemed too costly for the deception. Q-sites were built to represent an airfield at night and consisted primarily of stationary and moving lights to simulate the nighttime activity of an airfield. When bombers were spotted, the real airfield went dark and the Q-site went into action.
It was realized quite soon, though, that the sophistication necessary for this was getting very, very expensive. And at the same time, it had to be acknowledged, too, that the Germans' aerial reconnaissance had been pretty good in the interwar years. So after a certain amount of time, airfield camouflaging or deception was scaled down a little bit.
The daytime decoys could boast little success in fooling the Luftwaffe. Captured maps revealed that the Germans had identified all but 3 of the sites as decoys. However, the nighttime sites were attacked more than 350 times during the early part of 1941. From June through October of 1940, a period of intense Luftwaffe activity, the Q sites were attacked more than twice as often as the airfields they were protecting. Naval deception evolved along the same lines as its land-based counterpart in the first half of the 20th century. But the sea presents a number of unique problems when it comes to camouflage. Rapidly changing weather, light and sea conditions make it virtually impossible to effectively hide a ship. The pale blues or grays that blend in so well at dusk may only make a ship more conspicuous as the light changes. Dazzle painting was first tried in World War I. It was proposed that irregular patterns of contrasting colors could break up the familiar shapes of a vessel. Dazzle painting conceded the impossibility of hiding vessels as large as battleships in an unobstructed ocean and instead sought to obscure the ship's course and speed. Engineers soon learned to distort the area near the stern and forebridge, since they're most vital to calculating a ship's course, and that a color should not stop at an important structural detail. Sloping lines, stripes, and curves were found to be the most effective shapes in this sort of camouflage.
If you look at some of the quite amazing schemes that were on the major capital ships, it looks quite bizarre. Dazzle paint, whites and blacks and greys, sometimes greens, sometimes pink and blue being used. The aim really being to break up the design of the ship, not to make it disappear, because capital ships are really too large to disappear, but really to break up the design so when somebody is flying a torpedo bomber towards it, it can be off-putting for them trying to take a sight on a vulnerable place in the ship, or trying to get their torpedo to run in the position they wanted it to.
There was a bit of resistance to dazzle painting in the Admiralty. Many commanders thought that it made vessels look untidy. Still, there was a belief among some sailors that the gaudy paintwork bestowed a measure of good luck on a ship.
There was a great debate as to how effective these camouflage schemes were, and generally speaking, the proponents of the various schemes each thought that their own was the best. In the kindest sense, you could say it made people feel better and safer, and therefore it was a good thing.
As war approached again in the late 30s, there was an attempt to transform naval camouflage from an art into a science. Considerable research was conducted on the nature of color and what color or combinations of colors might make a ship less visible in varying light. But the normally staid Royal Navy was not above some surprising experimentation.
At the beginning of the Second World War, the British Royal Navy painted all their fast gunboats, their MTBs and MGBs, a shade of pink. When this was first mooted to the British Admiralty, they thought this was a ridiculous idea because obviously if it's at sea it should be grey.
This unconventional color choice was the idea of Admiral Louis Mountbatten, then in command of Britain's 5th Destroyer Flotilla, and so forever carries his name.
Under certain conditions of light, this Mountbatten pink worked. Under certain other conditions, however, the ships stood out as if they were fully illuminated.
Of course, paint and camouflage weren't the only means of nautical chicanery. False flags were flown to persuade the enemy that a ship was of a different nationality. This was a legitimate tactic under the rules of engagement, as long as ships hoisted their real flags at the outbreak of hostilities. Other ploys were not so legitimate.
The use of hospital ships is an example. Under the rules, a hospital ship has to be marked in a certain way. They're generally painted white overall. They carry big red crosses on their side with a green stripe along the hull, and they steam fully illuminated at night. They're allowed to have no communications equipment on board other than that which is necessary for the safe navigation of the ship, and they are not allowed to carry belligerent troops. The sole people allowed on board the ship are the ship's company, the medical staff, and the patients. But all sides have used hospital ships for nefarious purposes.
The unfortunate consequences of such tactics was that real hospital ships on legitimate missions of mercy were sometimes attacked. Nautical decoys of many types were employed for a wide range of purposes. In Africa, Jasper Maskelyne, a British stage magician charged mainly with field camouflage, was also working in the field of naval decoys.
One of the problems that the British had was that they had no ships at that point, or very few ships. So what Maskelyne was able to do is he was able to build warships out of balsa wood, out of canvas. They were total dummy contraptions. But from the air, they looked real. And as long as everything was in perspective, as long as it cast the right shadows, it was very difficult to tell from the air exactly what was going on. Because one of the things that helped Maskelyne is the warships themselves were camouflaged. So what Maskelyne would do is make one of his dummy contraptions and do a very poor camouflage job on it to make the German aerial reconnaissance people believe that they had uncovered something the British were trying to hide.
But not all dummies were so benign. The British Q-ship and the German raiders were examples of armed decoys. Used primarily during the First World War, both were merchant ships with armaments, guns, and occasionally torpedoes hidden behind shutters. Flags and distress signals to lure and sink commercial shipping. Though only used sporadically, they enjoyed considerable success. The Q-ship, however, which was designed to be used as a weapon against U-boats, did not have so auspicious a record. Q-ships carried two crews. The first, known as the panic crew, would abandon ship when a U-boat surfaced. When the submarine came closer, either to capture the ship or to sink her at close range with a deck gun, the second crew would drop the shutters and open fire.
There were well over 100 Q-ships deployed during the First World War. 31 of them were sunk in return for 11 U-boats. So it wasn't particularly successful in terms of numbers. When the Germans finally adopted unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, they began sinking ships on sight without bothering to surface and establish the nature of the cargo. Then the Q-ship concept was finally dead.
The Q-ship was revived in the Second World War with equally disappointing results. Of the 6 Q-ships commissioned, 2 were sunk, and the remaining 4 were retired without a single reported victory. The essence of deception, military or otherwise, is disinformation. The deliberate manipulation of truths, half-truths, and lies to gain tactical, strategic, or psychological advantage over an opponent. This can be done in many ways on a mass or individual scale. But the result of well-crafted and well-placed disinformation is the same: confusion, misjudgment, and mistakes.
Disinformation in psychological warfare has many uses. You can either do it to break the morale of troops or enemy populations. You can do it to convince commanders that you're going to go off in a different tactical scenario. You can use it strategically, tactically. Basically, it has no limits. I don't think anyone's actually thought of how far you can go with disinformation.
Perhaps the most basic technique for spreading disinformation during the Second World War was the use of leaflets. They could be packed in special artillery shells and fired over enemy lines, or when deeper penetration into enemy territory was required, they were dropped from airplanes. Known as propaganda bombs, leaflets were used extensively by both sides and were effective in spreading disinformation to both the populace and to enemy troops.
There was one newspaper which I worked on, as a matter of fact. It was a newspaper called Nachrichten für die Truppe, newspaper for the troops. And it was represented as having been printed in Berlin for the German troops in the field in France. It was prepared on the presses of the Luton News each day, went off to the American bomber squadrons, and they were dropped with special bombs onto the Germans every morning at 6 a.m. for breakfast, in time for breakfast.
With the advent of wireless communications, radio could be used as easily as more traditional forms of propaganda, with the possibility of reaching a much wider audience. Both sides used radio to spread propaganda. Radio Deutschland was a British operation staged so that it appeared to be the clandestine radio broadcasts of a German resistance group.
Radio Deutschland broadcast lies to the German troops. It would talk about troop movements that weren't true. It would talk about morale back home, which was bad anyway, but they'd make it worse. They were confusing the average German soldier.
The Allies learned of the success of the deception as the tide of the war turned and German soldiers were captured in greater numbers.
German prisoners would tell their captors to earn points, I was part of clandestine Radio Deutschland. I mean, the Germans thought it was that there really was a German resistance group, and the interrogators of the POWs thought there was. And it's another element that has to do with deception. Sometimes your own people don't know there's a deception plan going on. In fact, it makes the deception plan that much better if people act as if it's real.
Radio had also become the primary means of military communication in the Second World War. Every message, no matter how insignificant or mundane, could reveal an important piece of information in the hands of an astute intelligence officer.
In reality, good intelligence can be gleaned from listening into enemy radio traffic. So therefore it was very sensible that as a consequence of the reality of this intelligence, that deception could also be of some use. If you were listening for a particular type of radio traffic, of tank movements, troop movements, well, why don't you start faking those same sort of traffic?
Throughout the war, few deceptive operations were implemented in which radio signals did not play some part. They even played a small part in one of the best-known and most creative examples of disinformation in the Second World War.
Mincemeat was an operation to deceive the German High Command about the forthcoming invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943.
The first piece of the deception puzzle was a body acquired from a London pathologist.
The body of a man who has subsequently been identified as someone who simply died in a hospital in England.
He was given a name, Major William Martin. Identification papers were placed on the body along with the minutiae of everyday life. Theater tickets, a picture of a girlfriend, and a letter from a banker informing Major Martin that his account was overdrawn.
He was carrying a briefcase of the type used for carrying confidential documents, which was chained to his wrist, as was the custom for high-level couriers at the time.
In the briefcase were a number of documents, including a letter addressed to the British General Harold Alexander, which stated that the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia, and that the invasion of Sicily was just a cover operation. Radio reports were made stating that a Royal Air Force plane with a number of passengers had gone down in the Mediterranean.
The body is placed aboard a Royal Navy submarine. The submarine is taken off the coast of Spain, surfaces, and puts the body overboard.
Spain, though neutral, had close ties with Germany, and the British assumed that the discovery of the body of a British officer would be brought to the attention of the Nazis. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, the body washed up on shore at Huelva, where it was found by fishermen. Spanish authorities opened the case and photographed the contents.
The British naval attaché in Madrid was not in on the plan, and when the Spanish authorities at Huelva reported the presence of this body to him, he then made a routine signal to London to say that the body of Major Martin had been washed up. And virtually by return wire came this panic-stricken signal from London Where's the briefcase? Who's got the briefcase? Get it. The briefcase contains vital documents.
The body was then turned over to British authorities and given a Christian burial, but the disinformation had a much longer life. The photocopies were given to German intelligence in Spain, who sent them on to the German High Command in Berlin. On the 12th of May, orders were issued to withdraw German troops from Sicily and to reinforce Greece and the Balkans. By the time Allied forces landed on the 10th of July, only 2 German divisions remained to help the Italians defend Sicily. While it's not believed that mincemeat alone was responsible for the change in the displacement of German forces in the Mediterranean, most historians agree that it was a contributing factor. Still, not everyone is convinced of the operation's success.
Das ist die Geschichte von mincemeat und die Leute, die damit zu tun gehabt haben.
This is a story of mincemeat, and whoever was involved, and the authors who wrote about it, made a big success story out of it. So this had only been a deceiving maneuver, and the Germans would expect the Allies in the Baltic states, and didn't know that the attack would start in Sicily. In the lower ranks of the defense, one believed this, but the decisions that were made took place at a much higher level. And the mincemeat case never played a role in it at all.
Da hat diese Aktion mincemeat nie eine Rolle gespielt.
The Second World War saw each of the major powers either building or expanding organizations to gather and analyze intelligence.
Good intelligence is vital for any plan of deception. First of all, put it this way, simplest terms, it's good to know what it is the enemy fears.
But the gathering of intelligence doesn't end when the deception begins.
Secondly, of course, unless you've got good intelligence, you won't find out whether the plan's working. You want to make sure from his reactions what he thinks of your deception. If he doesn't appear to move at all, well, you may as well start again and try something quite different.
There were countless ways of gathering intelligence during the war. Aerial photography, intercepted communications, captured documents, prisoners of war, and, of course, espionage. It was the Germans' reliance on espionage and the British talent for the interception and decoding of radio communications that led to what is perhaps the best example of good intelligence contributing to successful deception in World War II. The double-cross plan was the British program of feeding disinformation to German intelligence through turned and double agents. By early 1942, the British were intercepting and decoding more than 39,000 secret German radio transmissions a month. Among the information gathered were the identities and situation of nearly every German agent being sent into England.
So they were sitting there on the ground waiting for the guy to land. And they gave the agent a very simple choice. You get hanged as a spy, or you work for us.
The next step in the creation of a double agent was to build his credibility in the eyes of his German controllers.
They would feed them what's called chicken feed in the trade. In other words, information which has some value, but at very limited value. So it could be checked out and found to be absolutely correct. Then the next piece of information would be a complete disinformation package, which they would believe because the initial chicken feed had been correct.
It was this careful balance between real information and false that kept the double-cross system secret and functioning throughout the war. In addition to German agents who'd been turned, a number of independent agents also passed disinformation to the Germans on behalf of the British. It was one of these double agents who perpetrated what was one of the most significant deceptions of the war.
His real name was Pujol, and his code name was Garbo. And he had been feeding the Germans some good information, with the help of the British, of course, and some false information. But the Germans came to believe completely in this man Garbo, in particular because just on the morning of the invasion, but too late to have any action taken on it, he stated that the attack was coming now.
Garbo continued to transmit in the crucial days following the landing.
What he did was wait until Hitler had given the order to commit the Panzer reserves and they were moving towards Normandy. At that moment, Garbo sent perhaps one of the most significant messages of the war, in which he communicated that he had confirmed Normandy was a deception, that the real invasion would occur very soon at Pas-de-Calais under Patton, and to do not commit all of the units to Normandy.
The receipt of Garbo's message gave him pause. He didn't know quite what to do. And then he cancelled his order and kept the army up in the Pas-de-Calais, useless, pinned down, and thus he divided his forces in two halves, which was a fatal mistake from his point of view because he lost the war at that moment.
Since the Second World War, the tools of military deception have continued to evolve as technology dictates they must. Camouflage, which in World War II needed only to fool the human eye or the camera, must now fool radar, as well as infrared and thermal imaging systems.
In terms of modern warfare, camouflage can also mean measures like emission control, the careful use of radio and radar so as not to give the position of your ship away to another ship with electronic monitoring equipment.
Advances in reconnaissance have made the use of decoys extremely difficult and nearly obsolete, though sometimes the old tricks still work, as the British learned in Operation Desert Storm.
One of the infamous retorts that came back from one of the anti-tank helicopter squadrons in the British Army, which had managed to knock out 14 targets that they thought were BMP personnel carriers and T-72 main battle tanks. One of the gunners said, "This is just like using a training aid." And suddenly it twigged on the, it suddenly became apparent to the commander that in fact this was a training aid. And they only used 14 missiles out on these decoys. This goes to show that even modern days you can decoy one of the best armies in the world.
Aerial surveillance went higher and faster and gave way to satellite reconnaissance. Disinformation, the primary tool of a small cadre of World War II deception masters, has been honed to a razor's edge by decades of Cold War. It is disseminated by the mass media to a world watching eagerly on television.
To give you an example, during the Gulf War, a major command center in Baghdad had an air raid shelter built on top of it. Allied intelligence had identified the command center, and it was one of the targets that was bombed. In that bombing, dozens of people were killed in the air raid shelter. The Iraqis immediately put out newsreel of the casualties at the scene, and the international media picked up the disinformation because the Allies were unable to prove until after the war that this had been a major communication center.
Intelligence organizations which were born or matured in the Second World War have grown and prospered. They gather and analyze massive amounts of intelligence on their enemies, as well as on their allies, and guard their own secrets all the more rigorously. Data on social, economic, political, and industrial factors is amassed and scrutinized in addition to military information. Because what was confirmed on the beaches, on the battlefields, and in the planning rooms of World War II was that war is not just about weapons and men. Winning can be as much a matter of surprise as preparation. And ultimately, nothing is more important than the secrets you keep and the lies you tell.